Welcome to the Luke Macias Show. I try to bring you conversations with lawmakers or commentary on the news of the day. And as we enter the legislative session, I also want a chance to talk to you about various different aspects of policy we need to focus on. I had an episode where I talked about 5 or 10 different policies that need to pass next session that aren't legislative priorities, right? And today, what we are going to do is break down for you the Texas budget. Now, my goal is that at the end of this episode, you have a much better idea of the size of our budget, what we spend our money on, and importantly, at the end, what a pathway to eliminating, at a minimum, the school portion of your property taxes would look like. We will likely have future conversations that talk about what a pathway to property tax elimination looks like outside of the schools. But right now we're going to focus on that. There's a very clear pathway to saying that the education portion of your property tax bill, which is the largest line item. I think every one of you know that when you get your property tax bill, you look at it, the biggest chunk is going to public schools. There is a path for Texas to be able to fill that bucket up entirely and you not have to pay that tax. So we will discuss that specifically, but more broadly speaking, how does the budget get built? What size is it? How much have we grown spending? So joining me today will be Andrew McVeigh with Texans for Fiscal Responsibility and Dr. Vance, Ginn, two people that I have worked with for a very long time and two people who have been very involved in the governmental process in Texas. Andrew McVeigh has worked for numerous conservative lawmakers in the Texas House of Representatives and has done a great job taking over the helm at Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. Just a couple weeks ago, he was in the Texas House testifying, basically pushing back and encouraging lawmakers to ban the foreign ownership of Texas land, telling them why Chinese nationals shouldn't be able to purchase Texas farmland and other Texas properties. Dr. Vance, Ginn has honestly a very long biography that we don't need to go through, but what you do need to know is that he has a PhD in economics, which means he probably knows more about these numbers than you do or I do. And the other thing is that he worked for the Office of Management and Budget at the Trump administration. So he's not just an expert at a state level of the budget process. He also knows a lot about the federal government. The last thing you need to know is if he ever disagrees with me publicly, I am right and he is wrong. So and to get that out of the way, in case any of y'all ever see Vance disagree with me, it probably means he just didn't understand that issue. Okay, so with that setting the table, Mr. McVeigh, before we get to Vance, Ginn and let him defend himself, can you please just give everyone a little bit of a background of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility and how y'all are going to be engaged on their behalf as taxpayers in this process?
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you, Luke, so very much for having us today. Texans for Fiscal Responsibility fundamentally is an organization that is focused on promoting pro-taxpayer reforms, right? Promoting reforms that are going to benefit taxpayers and their families. We're an educational nonprofit, and we're focused on, again, educating taxpayers on those issues that are going to affect their pocketbooks, that are going to affect their ability to truly thrive and prosper, right? And unfortunately, oftentimes across the United States and in Texas, believe it or not, the government is often one of the biggest obstacles to Texas families thriving, and the state and local level. And of course, property taxes are a big part of that. The government regulations and barriers to entry are a part of that. And so Texans for Fiscal Responsibility is all about educating taxpayers so that they themselves can advocate for pro-taxpayer reforms that are going to benefit them and their families, and getting government out of the way so that Texas families can prosper here in Texas.
Can you also talk about real quick the fiscal index? Because Sure. That's probably something that some activists are somewhat familiar with. Y'all have one of the most long-standing every session ratings of legislators and how they vote on behalf of taxpayers. And so this is something that during the election cycle will come up, how they voted. I want people to understand very quickly how that works, because you'll have a lot of these politicians who, after they are rated poorly, will try to have all these excuses. And so do y'all rate these things ahead of time? Do you let the lawmakers know what's fiscally responsible? How are you a voice for the taxpayers during the legislative process? And then how does that then work out through the fiscal index?
Sure. So the Fiscal Responsibility Index is like a report card, right, of how our legislators in Austin are performing each regular session. And the way it works is we will follow the session as it goes along. And if there's a bill or an amendment that's coming to the floor of either chamber that we think is important for taxpayers, maybe it's very anti-taxpayer or it's very pro-taxpayer, we'll reach out to these legislators and their staff and the public and let them know that this is something that we're watching, and we'll let them know our position on it, encouraging them to support the pro-taxpayer legislation, oppose the anti-taxpayer legislation. And so we're very upfront about those things that we're watching, and we're letting them know, hey, this is something we're probably going to be scoring at the end of session. And so that's the process during session. At the end of the session, when all the votes are taken, we will compile those votes that we were watching, and we'll put out the Fiscal Responsibility Index in the summer, not too long after the session is over, and it scores all the House members and all the senators on a 0 to 100 scale, using the A through F rating as well. And taxpayers can use that however they see fit, at the ballot box, engaging with those legislators in conversation. And it's a great tool for them to, again, see where their legislators, their reps or their senators stand on a lot of these taxpayer focused issues.
Just two quick stories on that note, and then we'll go to the budget as a whole. But Representative J.M. Lozano was on our program just a couple weeks ago and had a conversation and actually talked about one of his own constituents coming to him and showing him votes he had taken on the budget. We're about to talk about the budget, on the budget that they disagreed with. And they were pointing to the fiscal index, because when y'all publish this, you don't just say vote, you explain this is the vote, this is the amendment, this is what it did, this is why we thought it was in the best interest of taxpayers. And one of the things Representative Lozano said was, these people seem very informed. They know a lot. And so the work that y'all are doing gives them the tools to go to their lawmaker and say, hey, why did you vote this way or the other? And in some instances has produced some really productive conversations that lead those lawmakers to say, I want to be more fiscally responsible in the future. And in other instances, maybe is met with a lot of criticism. But that's one example. I remember having a conversation with a different lawmaker after last session. He didn't score very well, but this is somebody who considers himself to be very fiscally responsible and conservative. And one of the things that we found out through a conversation is that his staff in the Capitol wasn't sending him the notes y'all were sending, because you basically submit to all the staff, like, we think this is irresponsible. We think this is in the best interest of taxpayers. And his staff was not taking that information that they had and actually putting it on his vote recommendations or just letting him know the information. And so he's just voting blind and not realizing that the staff that he's hired are filtering out different grassroots organizations, which for that particular lawmaker is no longer a problem going into this session. And so I think those are some good examples for people to understand how an organization like TFR is giving every opportunity to these politicians to be aware. Ultimately, it is their responsibility of how they vote and their staff's responsibility as far as how they inform them of the information that y'all are giving them. So with that, I want to quickly get to the Texas budget. Dr. Vance, Ginn, look, you have a lot of stuff in your background, and I know we could spend a long time talking about that. You've done work at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. You're doing work today for Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. You worked in the Trump administration. You work in other states, providing other state policy groups with fiscal, budget policies and fiscal policies and all sorts of other stuff. So you know a ton about a ton, but here's our goal today. We want to break down for the average person how the budget gets built, how large it is, what the last several years of significant spending have done, how has that occurred. And I want people to understand the budget process a little better. And then we'll end the conversation with the conversation on property tax relief. So, Vance, with that, why don't you start taking us away and we'll pipe in with some questions.
All right. Well, thanks, Luke. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And yes, sometimes we'll disagree cordially on Twitter or something else, but we're always friends at the end of the day. And I don't know if you're always right, but it's good to have a good discussion either way. But yeah, so the state budget when we're talking about this, one thing to think about is that, it's for every 2 years. It's a biennial budget that very few other, I think there's like 5 or 6 budgets overall across the country even have a biennial budget. So it's quite fascinating what we're able to do in Texas to budget for the next 2 fiscal years. So think about how difficult it is to budget sometimes month to month, much less 2 years in the future. But that's what the Texas legislature does and what many of you will be doing that are watching this. And so it's really important to see how the sausage is made throughout that process. And so when you look at the budget process, and we're looking at a presentation, if you're watching this online, but I'm going to walk through it even if you're not, is that it starts with the governor and the legislative budget board providing a mission statement. Basically, what should the legislature pass next session? What are the key priorities that are going to be in there? And so that's Governor Abbott today, or whoever the governor is at the time, along with the legislative budget board, which is led by the lieutenant governor, the speaker of the House, and then 3 members who are appointed from the House by the Speaker, and then 3 members appointed from the Senate by the Lieutenant Governor. And they sit on this board, and there's a huge staff and everything else. And this is where you'll talk a lot with members of the Legislative Budget Board staff whenever you're a member and say, hey, can you give me a number on this? Or what's the fiscal note? How do you score this? Things of that nature. You'll talk a lot with this staff. But the Legislative Budget Board itself, really runs a lot of things that are going on during the interim and getting ready for the next budget cycle. The governor will put out a budget that's more of a ceremonial budget here in Texas, but it does lay out the priorities that's going on. And then you have each agency is going to prepare their strategic plan. What do they think they want or need from hiring FTEs, staff, for looking at how to provide more services in certain areas, depending on what's underneath the laws that are provided by the legislature. And so all those things are really important. The LBB then sends out the legislative appropriations request instructions for agencies saying, hey, you need to fill out this information by this date. You need to provide this information. In the past, there has also been some indications of you need to cut by 5, 10, 15% as part of your appropriations request. We probably should do that every session, by the way, but sometimes that's happened in the past. And the LBB prepares a draft of the budget. This is even before the session starts, right? It's the previous members who are developing the budget for the upcoming session, just the way the process works. The budget is filed in both legislative chambers pretty early on during the session. You get the session that starts early January, probably the end of January, early February is when you'll get both chambers providing their budgets. And it goes, each session is a different budget. One year will be the House will start it, House Bill 1. And then the next session, it'll be a Senate Bill 1. And they go through, and that leads a lot of the discussion and everything else to kind of give each chamber their prize, if you will, of having more say in how the budget process gets started. But regardless, each chamber will have their own budgets to go through. And this will all be discussed. There'll be a lot of appropriations hearings and Senate finance hearings. Ways and Means will even have a part of this as well, depending on what happens with taxes or property taxes, like we'll get into in a little bit. And then, after the passage, the budget goes to the conference committee, and there'll be a big budget nights. The House budget night is quite fantastic. If you're running the House and you get in the House, it's one of those times where there's a lot of back and forth. Things get feisty sometimes. It lasts late into the night. And the Senate on the other side is much more procedural, a little bit more boring, if you will, in budget night. But regardless, both of them will pass their budget, and then there's going to be differences. It'll go to conference committee. The Senate and the House will discuss, or they'll appoint people who will talk about the budget during conference, and they'll work with the lieutenant governor, the speaker, and the governor to make any tune changes to pass a final budget. It's an up or down vote once the conference committee budget comes to the floor. And then after certification, the budget is sent to the governor. And then the governor can have line item vetoes and strategic sort of budget the way that we have it today. And then the budget implemented over the next 2 fiscal years. So this is from start to finish. You've got a while to look at these things, but a lot of the budget is done before you even get into session. You will have an opportunity to change and tweaks and ask questions. I think that's the biggest part of this is the transparency and asking questions like we're going to get into today. But Luke, I don't know if you or Andrew have any other thoughts, but that's really the full budget process part of it.
Yeah, so I want to just synthesize that down. The Legislative Budget Board is probably something that most people aren't super familiar with, but these are staff members who work closely with the Senate, the House, the governor's office, and they're largely writing the budget. They get these requests from state agencies. They get requests from, and lobbyists are working members and agencies to make larger requests for projects they want funded and all these things. So these requests get made. The Legislative Budget Board is kind of going back and forth. That group, the speaker, the lieutenant governor, they have kind of directional guidance that they can provide. Hey, this is our big picture of where we think we're headed before the actual committee's actually writing the budget. And to your point you made, actually, this has come up a number of times this year, but in the past, they've pushed state agencies, I need you to identify 5 or 10% of savings in your budget. And that would actually make them show the lawmakers where they probably are least, like where they're spending money that isn't absolutely necessary. And then they have to almost fight back up to getting the full amount they got last time if they do a really good job advocating. But currently going into this year, there have been no such directions given to state agencies. So we'll get to that in a second. I mean, state agencies basically assume every dollar they got last year, they're getting again. And now they're trying to fight to see if they can get more dollars from the extra money we have. But the Legislative Budget Board and all these requests come in. Those then go to the Appropriations Committee. One of the chambers starts the budget. I think this year it's in the Senate. Is that correct?
I believe that's right. Yeah.
So the Senate will start this year. SB 1 will be the bill. If you know how to get on and look for bills, SB 1 will be the budget bill. It will start in the Senate. It will pass the Senate first. It'll go to the House. The House Appropriations Committee will make adjustments. One of the things I know you've done in the past, Vance, for lawmakers and a lot of us, which has been very helpful, is whenever they do pass the budget, you'll do a comparison, every single line item. I've been with you in rooms and lawmakers looking at all these graphs and charts. Okay, they gave this agency this much 2 years ago. They're giving them this much this time. Then when the House passes its budget, you have a whole nother chart to add. Okay, so the House wanted to give this line item 15 million. The Senate gave them 13 million, and last year they got 16 million. So both have cut them, but it looks like the House, and so you can get a real good comparison of where these things are laying out. But this, then they go to conference, and the conference committee, we really don't know what happens there, meaning it's not a transparent process. The conferees, the appropriators on the House and the Senate get together, and they're horse trading. Okay, I'll fund this project if you fund this. You come up and match us where we want to fund this group, and we'll then cut like you want to cut over here. And then they come back to the chambers and say, here's the final budget. Everybody votes up or down. And the last thing I was going to say within this process, before we go to the last couple budgets, is that the amount of property tax relief that you will get is also determined by this budget, because they have a couple mechanisms, which we'll get to at the end. So during this budget debate, they're also discussing the property tax relief aspect, because they will appropriate money to go towards either things that they otherwise would use local property taxes to fill, or to specifically fund, buy downs, such it. So did I miss anything, or did I misstate anything from there?
No, I think that's good.
Let's go on to kind of where is the money coming from? How big is the budget, and where is this money coming from in the state?
Yep. And so on our part of our presentation, but what we're looking at here is basically estimated tax revenues from the state, where that comes in from. And it's about $360 billion. Remember, it's a biennium. So it's about $180 billion per year, but $360 billion for the biennium. A large portion of that, about a quarter of that, is just from sales taxes. A third of that is actually federal funds. So the money that we're sending to the federal government, along with other money that's in there, they send it back to us. And some of those state funds primarily is Medicaid. I mean, that's the one that dominates the Medicaid funding, because we have what's called the FMAP, the Federal Matching Assistance Program, where for every basically 40 cents that we send in for Medicaid, the federal government sends 60 cents. And so that contribution contributes to a lot of revenue that comes into the state to spend on Medicaid. But there's also spending for transportation, for education, and some other factors, but that's the one that really dominates. But it's something key to remember, is that a third of our budget, the revenue, is federal funds. It's a massive amount. And given the debt crises and the spending crisis that's happening in the federal government, I think one place they're going to start cutting is to states. And so this is an area that I think we could reduce our dependency on the federal government over time. But it's important to point that out. There are other non-tax receipts at 15.6%. There's severance taxes, which is 5%. That's your taxes on oil and gas production. There's the motor vehicle sales and rental taxes, about 4%. Franchise tax, that's the business franchise tax, is 3.8% of total revenue. And that's also called the margins tax. There's different names for it. There's licenses, fees, fines, and penalties, about 3.8% of that $360 billion. Other taxes, insurance taxes, and motor fuel taxes make up about 7% of the overall funding that's coming in. And so you have a lot of funding sources. The main one for the state, though, is the sales taxes, which is 6.25% on everything that we buy. There's some exemptions in there, but that's really the primary source for state general funds. And then you have, of course, the federal funds and other things. And part of our Constitution says that we have a tax and expenditure limitation. So it's not only a limitation on the spending part of it, which we'll get into, but you also have on the tax side where those two must equal. We have a balanced budget amendment as part of our Constitution that we have to run. We can't run deficits. There will be shortages here and there from time to time, but for the most part, you've got to make sure that you're balancing your budget over time. And so with all that revenue that's coming in, now let's look at the spending side. Let's look at the budget. Whenever you look at the Texas budget, I wanted to mention too about the Legislative Budget Board will come out with a big report that if you haven't read it yet, you should start looking at it, called the Fiscal Size Up. And they have that one out now for 24-25, which is the current biennial period. That'll go through everything that they passed last session. It'll talk about the comparisons between the 2023 budget, 2022-23 budget, and the 24-25 budget, and highlight some of the key areas like property tax relief, Medicaid, and some other things. But I think it's really important, Luke and Andrew and you and I, we've talked about this, to make sure that we have a consistent comparison over time. Not one that's an apples to oranges comparison, but apples to apples, just like you would do with your own budget when you start the month of August or September, and then you start it again in October. How much did you spend? And then you look at the end of the month. How much did you actually spend? That's the same thing we need to do at the state level as well. Unfortunately, the numbers that are in the Fiscal Size Up by the Legislative Budget Board, and they're following the law and everything else, okay? But they'll put expended budgeted for 22-23 and then appropriated for 24-25. So what that ends up meaning is that there's a lot more in the 22-23 numbers than there are in the 24-25 numbers, and it makes it an apples to oranges comparison. And I mention all that because in their Fiscal Size Up, they will show that the budget, the amount of appropriations, was $321.7 billion. That was an increase of the previous budget, expended budgeted of $8.4 billion, for an increase of 2.7%. That doesn't sound like a whole lot. That's actually well below population growth plus inflation of the number they use of about 12% whenever they use population plus inflation for the spending limit. And then even if you look at state funds, exclude federal funds, that increased to $219.4 billion, which was a $32 billion increase of 17.2%. And a lot of that was driven by the property tax relief that was provided of about $12.7 billion in new property tax relief. There was another $5.3 billion to maintain old property tax relief to get us up to $18 billion, but the new relief was the $12.7. And so when we're looking at these numbers, the key things to me is to look at state funds and all funds in these budget numbers, but because these were massive increases. And then, you keep looking at these numbers over time, and you go to the frozen Texas budget. There are different ways to compare these numbers, but if you really wanted to look at restrain the growth of spending over time, why have it grow at all? Have a no growth budget. And that's what we've called the frozen Texas budget at the Texans for Fiscal Responsibility, of saying, here's initial appropriations in 2022-23. They shouldn't grow, right? We're already spending way too much anyway. And then that's what it should be for the 24-25 period. And instead, the budget grew to $321.7 billion. So using those same numbers that the LBB reports in their Fiscal Size Up, what you see is from appropriations to appropriations, initial appropriations, the state funds budget increased by $53.1 billion, which was an increase of 32%. And all funds increased by $56.9 billion, which was a 21.5% increase in the budget. These are record increases in the overall size of the budget. And it's another another reason why we need to make sure we're not spending too much in the future. And one reason why I mentioned earlier that we should be looking at 5%, 10%, 15% cuts because so much spending happened last session. We can also break down what each article of the budget. Go ahead.
I want you to, because I know we're going to have a ton of information on this episode, so it's going to be hard. Some people might have to go watch it or listen to it a couple times. So I want to unpack just a few things you covered there. I want you to re-explain how appropriators can, in one side, give you this number that says, hey, we only grew spending 2.7%. And then when you unpack, I want to just break that down in layman's terms, because there might be some things we don't cover today because there's so much to understand about the budget process. But this alone, I think, would be really helpful for the average Texan to see and understand some of the reasons why they'd be able to tell you, your state rep could tell you, I only grew spending 2.7%, when in all reality, spending grew much more. So can you go back, re-explain that?
Yeah. Let me re-explain that. So 22-23, just to put a fine tune to what we're talking about here, the LBB will show a $313 billion budget. In 24-25 is $321 billion. So that's the 2.7% increase. But in layman's terms, what they're comparing is how much did you spend? Let's think about your own budget, right? At the end of September 2024, how much did you spend? And then how much do you plan to spend in October and the first of the month? So if you think about on a 2-year budget cycle, though, they're looking at the end of one budget period of 22-23, and then at the very beginning of the 24-25 saying this is how much we're going to spend for the rest of the 2-year period. And what we know from history is that they will come in and they'll pass supplemental bills, supplemental budget, which means that it will backfill anything that was not funded appropriately during the biennium from that initial appropriation. And it's always up, Luke. I mean, a big one is always Medicaid. They will underfund Medicaid primarily to keep the reimbursement rates lower than otherwise. Because if not, if you just said, okay, I'm going to appropriate $100 billion or whatever it is, instead of $80 billion, they will make those reimbursement rates such that will equal that higher amount. So instead, what they'll do is they'll lowball it, and then they'll see, okay, well, here's the reimbursement rates we'll set, and then the enrollment numbers, the number of people served, will be what will change the actual amount of expenditures, and that's why Medicaid ended up going up higher. And so what we see is this backfilling, along with any additional expenditures during the 22-23 period. All that's included in the LBB's numbers, whereas in 24-25, it's just at the beginning of the session without all those backfilling and everything else. So that's why I really argue it's an apples to oranges comparison, and it's not a consistent comparison between the two.
Yeah, I want to explain how this supplemental appropriations are used by politicians often, how I've seen them used by politicians for a long time. And then, Mr. McVeigh, I'd love for you to kind of come in and insert your insight on top of this. So for the average person out there, the way it will work is that the politicians will pass a certain budget, and they will say, this is our budget. And just to make things easy, a $300 billion budget, right? And they'll say, oh, this $300 billion budget we have is great, and it's only X amount of growth. Okay. Now, what the first thing they do before that is that when they start the session, let's say, just for simple math's sake, that the last budget that they had passed was 200 and instead of 300 billion, it was 270 billion, right? So a $300 billion would be almost a 10% increase, 30 billion in addition. So it's a 270 billion. The next one's going to be 300 billion. The first thing they'll do at the start of the session is they'll come in and say, hey, we've got some Medicaid to fill, which they never campaigned on, spending additional money, but they go, we got Medicaid to fill. And oh, by the way, there's this water project. And oh, by the way, there's this other thing we're trying to take care of. And there's one little state agency. So they fill a couple things in there. But one of the key reasons to spend another 5 or 10 or whatever $1 billion they're going to spend, okay, is to take that base budget of 270 and take it up to 280 or up to 285. And the reason for that is that they want it to then be larger so that when they pass the even larger budget, it's a smaller increase. I hope that makes sense to the average person listening. But like, if I said I spent 270, I campaigned on that, Then I pass a supplemental to go to 285. Then my next budget I'd tell you is going to be 300. I'm comparing 285 to 300 saying, hey, I really only grew it $15 billion. Inflation's a lot. We basically didn't grow government. Then that 300 billion that they just passed, they actually know they've left a lot of holes unfilled. So they're going to come back in 2027 and go, hey, we've got another X billion dollars to add on to this budget. And so that's the way they're kind of constantly giving you the smallest number possible in growth. And that I feel like, and Mr. McVeigh, you can come in on this, but I almost feel like this whole supplemental approach is designed to be able to campaign on as small a budget increase as possible and then to give yourself this path to grow things even more. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's right. And what's going on here is they're trying to hide the size and the scope and the growth of government. I tell folks, or I ask folks when I go and speak, I'll ask them, how do you measure the size and the growth of government, right? And you can kind of do it by how many laws and rules they're passing, but sometimes those laws are subjective, right? It could be a good law or it could be a bad law, but an objective way that you can measure the size and the growth of government is by how much of your money that they're spending, right? And so, if you pass that $270 billion budget, as you mentioned, for example, 2 years ago, and you come in and you pass these supplemental appropriations bill that spend an additional, 10, 15, $20 billion, and then you pass a $300 billion budget, when you go and then you go and you compare 2 years ago budget plus the supplemental, compare it to this new budget, well, then you only grew government a small percentage. And so it's a way to hide the growth of government in a sense. And it's not really honest and it's not forthright. Mm-hmm. And as Vance has said several times now, it's comparing apples to oranges, not apples to apples.
Yeah. And I would just add too, it also helps them because it increases the base that the spending limit is determined by, which gives them more room to spend.
That's what I want to get to next, Vance, actually. Yep. So that's perfect segue. So there's a couple different things I'd like you to comment on, Vance, that will help people understand other things that they do to give themselves more wiggle room and how they spend money. So you just touched on the first one. So the first one is that one reason to add these supplementals is that it raises your ceiling for your spending cap. Explain to people how they're limited, both constitutionally and statutorily, how they're limited. And then we'll also talk, I don't want to talk about it right now. I want to first talk about the supplemental and how that affects this. And then we're going to go on to why they constitutionally dedicate certain funds and how that also gives them more flexibility. So explain the limits that we have and how supplemental appropriations are actually used to kind of give them more options.
Yeah. So the constitutional spending limit is one that covers non-constitutionally dedicated general revenue, which is only about 40 to 45% of the budget, depending on the year, but less than half of the budget, the full budget, $320 billion, is actually underneath the constitutional spending limit. And it's based on the growth in the economy that in statute is determined as personal income growth. And so they'll use personal income growth for that. That's under the constitutional spending limit of only about 40 to 45% of the budget. And then in 2021, in order to improve the spending limit as a whole, and it's something I had worked on for many years, there was a good bill by Senator Kelly Hancock, SB 1336, that made a statutory change. In addition to the constitutional spending limit, there's another one that's based on consolidated general revenue, which is about 50 to 55% of the budget. So let's say about half, a little bit more than half of the budget is now covered. And that is based on population growth times inflation. So these times inflation, but it's a lower growth rate and it covers more of the budget. I think at the end of the day, we should see that be the constitutional spending limit, if not even improve from that. But that is those are the two big metrics. And what you have then are two different measures of general revenue: non-constitutionally dedicated general revenue and consolidated general revenue. So the more that you can increase those budget numbers in your base from one period to the next through the supplemental budget, then you can increase the base to then give you more room to spend in the next period. And that's still underneath the constitutional spending limit. And it allows for you to have as a pay-as-you-go limit, which is the balanced budget requirement based on revenue. So as long as you stay under revenue and as long as you stay underneath that spending limit, you can spend as much as you want. And given that we have such high personal income growth rates and high population plus inflation recently, that's led to at least gives them more room to spend compared to where they were previously, which is one reason why we've been focusing on the frozen Texas budget and some other things. But these spending limits are key rules that keep us within the realm of what we should be spending. Of course, we should spend less, but that really allows for the supplemental then to increase the base and give you more room to spend for the next budget period.
The budget limits, the spending limits, there have been sessions in the past where we came in with such a big surplus that they basically couldn't spend all the money because of the spending limits. So then you need to put in an extra $10 billion in supplemental so that you can spend the $10 billion that you already don't know if you're going to be able to spend in this budget. And then it also gives you another $10 billion to spend in the next budget, plus whatever constitutional growth is allowed it or statutory growth is allowed. And so 10 billion plus 6% of population inflation. Now that's another 600 million. That's for the other projects we want to fund. So you can kind of see how they're trying to fill it in to make sure that these constitutional spending limits and the statutory spending limit don't hinder too much the different projects they want to put money into. Explain why they would want to put some money into constitutionally dedicated funds, because that's another, I think, often path used to give themselves more flexibility on some of the spending limits. So I want you to explain, Vance, why you will see these pushes to constitutionally dedicate certain money into funds and how that also affects your spending limits moving forward.
Yeah, so the constitutionally dedicated accounts where they'll put those in place for transportation. There's also some from the lottery fund. There's a number of things where the revenue sources are coming in. They'll constitutionally dedicate them to certain areas. Another big one is education. And they'll do a lot of this because it gets it outside of the constitutional spending limit. Remember, it's non-dedicated general revenue. So if you dedicate it, constitutionally dedicate it, then it's outside of that. So you can spend as much of that as you want, which is one reason why I mentioned that the constitutional spending limit is only on about 40 to 45% of the budget. That means the other 50 to 55% or more could actually grow by much more than population inflation or personal income growth, whatever they want to set it as. And that is a big problem. And it makes it to where the budget grows much faster than what the spending limit would be. And a recent one was the Texas Energy Fund, $5 billion. That's not going to be counted. There was another one for water this past session of $1 billion. That will not be underneath the spending limit. So we have to be very cautious about dedicating funds. And in fact, at some point, I think we should get away from constitutionally dedicating funds, because if it's a priority, spend it within the general revenue. Don't have it outside of the budget. And then that way it's there for next session, and you can appropriate it again if it's that much of a priority. I'm not saying that transportation and other things shouldn't be, but let's do it within the budget cycle of what's under discretion and not constitutionally dedicate these funds. Because another big part of this, Luke, is that the more you constitutionally dedicate funds for spending, means you can't use it for tax relief. And that's a whole other issue with our property tax relief plan.
My last question before we get to property taxes is, break down the biggest buckets in our over $300 billion biannual budget. Okay. So what is the bulk of this spent on? If somebody's going, what are they spending my money on? Give them a kind of 45-second minute overview of how this gets broken down, broadly speaking.
So when you look at general revenue funds, which they'll say they have the most discretion over, that's about $145 billion, okay? $70 billion of that is for just education, so about half is just on public ed. $42 billion is for health and human services, so a smaller share of that. But when you get further out and you look at the all funds budget for federal funds and state funds, health and human services is $102 billion out of that $320 billion. So you're talking about a third of it. And then you have agencies of education is $122 billion. So even more of that. So you're really looking at about 2/3 of the budget is just education and healthcare. Mainly think about Medicaid as being that main part of health and human services, and K through 12 education is the main part of public education. Those two are the biggest parts of the budget, about 2/3 of the overall budget. And even more than that, about 80% when you just look at general revenue.
So without getting in, we're not going to get into healthcare reform, welfare reform, Medicaid, for anything like that today. But that is a third of the budget. Another third of the budget, roughly speaking, is public education. And that spending has only increased over the years, continually increased and gone up. And then that leaves a third of the remaining portion. Mm-hmm. And some of that is transportation and other aspects. And then you have your state agencies that get funded through that other third, right? And it's your comptroller and your attorney general has thousands of employees. And, your higher education, is higher ed in that 1/3 of education, or is that outside of? Okay. Yeah. So the education third covers pub ed and higher ed, all of your university spending, and your water infrastructure that gets funded. That's all in the additional third outside of the education chunk, the health and human services chunk. It just falls into all other state agencies. Now, most of the fights we have on fiscal policy are in the third that is outside of education and healthcare. Is that for the most part correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So this gets us into a conversation. Okay. So we at a minimum, I hope people, probably not budget experts by the end of this, but they at least understand a little bit more about how the process works. What are some of the tools used by most elected officials to kind of increase spending over time? The last thing we'll do before property tax relief, I know I keep saying last thing, but there's a lot to cover here. Can you talk about how much spending has increased just over the last 10 years, 8 years as an example? Because that will actually get into the property tax relief conversation, Vance. Let's just talk about overall spending increases for Texas over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, so if you look at the total budget over the last 10 years, I mean, we're talking about a substantial increase. I want to say it's about 60 to 70% increase in the overall budget. But I do have the numbers on a biennial percent changes, what that would look like from the 2004 to 2015 period, so the previous decade. All fund spending for the appropriations was up 12% per biennium compared to population plus inflation of 7.4%. Whereas the last decade, from 2016 to 2025, the initial appropriations was up 8.9%, so slower than that 12%, and even slower than population plus inflation, that's up now to 9.5%. But I mean, it's still too fast, right? Because inflation's rising so rapidly, given what the Congress is overspending and the Federal Reserve overprinting of money. And so it's good that they're below it, a population plus inflation, but not by much. They're at 8.9 compared to 9.5%. And that's another reason, to your point, that's leaving less money available to return to taxpayers through property tax relief because of the excessive spending that's happened over the last decade.
Okay, so let's talk about property taxes. There is going to be a discussion, and Texans across the board do support trying to get rid of as many property taxes as possible. Okay, some people say cut it tomorrow. Some people say cut it in 10 years. Some people say get rid of the school portion first. And at some point, Vance, I'll have you on and we'll do a good homestead versus M&O compression debate about that pathway. But we're not going to talk about that today. What I want to talk about today is what the property tax bucket looks like, how we're continuing to increase those, because many of these property taxes we're talking about are outside of the budget we just discussed, right? So the property taxes that you're sick and tired of paying are not in this bucket. And so explain basic property tax growth, how that's working, and what our path looks like to elimination.
Howdy, folks. It's Chris Salcedo from the Salcedo Storm podcast. You might know me from my TV show on Newsmax or my radio show on AM 700 KSEV in Houston. As a veteran broadcaster, author, and conservative political analyst, I've teamed up with Texas Scorecard to take a no-nonsense approach to the toughest questions Americans are wrestling with every day. Join me on the Salcedo Storm podcast, where I challenge the status quo and bring you fresh perspectives on the national, state, and cultural news. Tune in weekdays, available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Yeah, so property taxes, I mean, of course, that dominates most local governments. Around 80% of their revenue comes from property taxes, the other part being sales taxes, and then they have fines and fees and some other things that they collect, but it's dominated by property taxes, okay? And I should know, too, that we have a constitutional amendment saying that there cannot be a statewide property tax, just like there's a constitutional amendment that says we can't have income taxes. Both of those, I thank the Lord for. We don't need those. But the local governments can have these property taxes, and it amounts to about $82 billion that's collected from total property taxes across the state. When you look at special purpose districts, which is about $12.6 billion. So those are like your MUDs, other things that are not cities, counties, and school districts. Whatever that is on your bill, that's the part that goes in there. Like hospital districts is another one that will pop up as special districts. That area has grown by leaps and bounds over the last decade. And then you look at counties. Counties bring in about $14.3 billion in 2023. Cities bring in $14.9 billion. And then school districts, $39.8 billion. So about half of total property taxes collected across the state are from school districts. Now, part of that is maintenance and operations, which is the funding for teachers and leaving the lights on. A lot of your variable cost, if you think about it that way. And then there's the INS, which is the debt portion of the school property tax, which covers a lot of your football stadiums, your schools, the building, right? The infrastructure, the fixed costs. And so that is about $7 billion is part of the debt. The other $33 billion of that school portion is for maintenance and operations, which is the one that we've really been focusing on, trying to eliminate that first by the state level. But even, if you look at this, the growth, it's been substantial over time. If you look at since 1998 to 2003, special purpose districts are up 571%, cities up 403%, counties up 445%, school districts up 256%. Well, then you say, okay, well, what does that mean? How does that compare with other metrics? Well, personal income growth was up 289%. And population plus inflation, it was up only 136%. So these rates of growth in these property taxes are growing much faster than the average taxpayer's ability to pay for really government spending, but these property taxes in particular. And that's why, unfortunately, Luke, too many low-income folks and those who are seniors on fixed income are the ones that are losing their home because, today their tax payments per month are more expensive than their monthly mortgages were, and they may have already paid off their house. And so this is a major issue that's contributing to the affordability crisis that's also being done at the federal level.
I want to break down what you just said real quick. So from 1998 to 2023, okay? 1998, I was 8 years old, to 2023, population and inflation have gone up 136%, right? So that is dollar for dollar, the difference of the buying power of your money, right? Population inflation have gone up 136%. So if the property tax burden also went up at 136% across the board, you would say your property tax bill is higher, but the real burden compared to what your income likely is probably not changed. That would be the general, it's a general rule. It wouldn't apply to everybody, but generally that would work. Unfortunately, though, instead of special districts, all these MUDs and PUDs and utility districts, instead of their property tax burden on the average Texan going up 136%, it went up 571%. And instead of, ISDs going up 136%, it went up 256%. And instead of counties going up 136%, they went up 445%. And instead of cities going up 136%, they went up 403%. So that is why when so many times, sometimes people go, oh, back in my day. And you're like, no, really, if you do the math, you don't understand what back in your day was. But in this case, it really is true. Like if you meet somebody that says, man, 30 years ago, I could pay my property tax bill and it wasn't sucking so much of my income out. That's an accurate statement. Like it is taking so much more out of the average household's income to just pay their property tax bill.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And the key here, Luke, is that the key here is that it's not just that, you know, these local governments are having to, you know, pay more for all of the people coming in and account for the inflation. And that's part of it. But fundamentally, we have elected officials across the board that have an addiction to spending our money. And these local governments are growing far beyond the people and the economies that they're intended to be the servants of and not the masters of, right? And so the roles are getting reversed.
This is going to get into a conversation, Vance, about the property tax burden that Texans are bearing compared to the rest of the country. So how do we compare to other states? And then, you know, what you'll always hear is, well, the good news is we don't have an income tax. So suck it up, guys, write that check and tell us thank you that you don't have an income tax. So first, I want to know where we compare to the rest of the country. And then second, what about states that don't have an income tax? Is this just a thing where every state that doesn't have an income tax is just giving you this massive property tax bill? Break that down for us as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and it's something that is talked about often, right? We want to see how we compare with other states. And so the Tax Foundation has done this work for us, and what they do is they take the property taxes paid across the state as a percentage of owner-occupied housing values. So they look at the effective rates of property taxes as a better measure of the burden on individuals, and in particular by owner-occupied housing. And so what they find is that in Texas, we have the sixth highest burden of about 1.6%. And so that's substantial, the sixth highest burden. And to your point, though, too, which is a good one, is they'll say, well, that's because you don't have an income tax. So you got to tax something and get a lot of revenue. And my argument is always, well, no, it's because of overspending. So if you look at other states that also don't have an income tax, which there are 7 states without a personal income tax, and more of those are continuing to grow, but you also have Florida with no personal income tax. Where do they rank? They rank about the middle of the pack at about 26th in burden of this effective property tax rate. And then you take Tennessee, another red state with no personal income tax. They rank 37th in property tax burden. And so it's not about that we don't have a personal income tax, so you've got to tax something else and property taxes are going to be high. It's because we have a local government spending problem that's growing at a rapid rate, and they're funding it on the back of property taxpayers instead of sales taxes and other things. Because remember, we have some limitations, which we could talk about that too, on existing property, 3.5% for cities and counties and 2.5% for school districts, and some on the special purpose districts at 3.5%, which is good. If you want to go above that, all they have to do is go out to the voters and get them to approve it. But so at least there's some checks and balances that are there. But remember, that's only existing property tax revenue. All the new property tax revenue, these 1,000 people moving to Texas on average per day, none of that is included in underneath the limitations, which allows for property taxes to grow at a much faster rate, increasing the burden on Texans across the state.
Yeah, because all this new building gets, basically, you give all these local governments, you get 100% of that money, and it in no way fits into these caps on your increase in spending. Then they have the ability, even when we often provide relief, the total amount that they take in, the actual bucket of property taxes, isn't moving down because they just, they don't increase people much. They get a bunch of new buildings in. And if anything, we provide relief. But the reality is we actually collect more in property taxes at the same time while providing relief, which just perpetuates the system. Because at the end of the day, even with the relief pushes, and I want to say this real quick, there are a lot of elected officials who have pushed very hard to provide Texans relief, and against people, Republicans and Democrats both, who didn't want to provide relief. And I'm very grateful for the work that has been done to provide the relief that has been given. But all of the relief that has been given, every year I've been in Texas politics since I was 16 years old, every politician goes, we need property tax relief. And then they all campaigned and said, we gave you property tax relief. But we're still the 6th highest in the nation, even after every single campaign pledge of property tax relief and every appropriation of property tax relief, right? So that has not stopped us from still having sky high property taxes.
Yep.
So
it's a great point. And one thing, let me just break this down just real quick, Luke, about the rollback rates that we'll hear a lot about. But basically, you have a no new revenue rate, which is the key one that we should get to. Basically, being that you have the property appraisals. Let's say if it increases by 10%, the rate should then go down by 10%, which is set by the local taxing entity. You have the appraisal district that does the appraisal. The local taxing entity, like the city of Austin or whoever it is, well, they set the tax rates, and that means that the revenue, the levy that they're bringing in from those existing property cannot grow by more than anything. It has 0% growth if you have the no new revenue rate. That's what we should be trying to push to at some point. Right now we have the rollback rates of 3.5% and 2.5%. That just means that given the appraisals and given the tax rates, that the revenue that they bring in from that existing property cannot grow by more than 3.5% or 2.5%. And so you'll hear a lot about these different numbers and words, and it's really complicated. It's too complicated, okay? But at the end of the day, think about that no new revenue rate as being the tax rates that are determined to not bring any more revenue in unless you have voter approval. And that's why the taxing entities are so important and our levy limits are so important, not just the appraisal cap.
I've explained this before in the past, but I'm just going to explain it in layman's terms. Then Mr. McVeigh, I have a question for you. The reason that the Texas budget is relevant in this discussion with property taxes is that the largest line item on your property tax bill is your schools. Okay. And the reality is that we have a mechanism through M&O compression where if we write a check for 10, let's just say, and in fact, Vance and I have talked about this, the school portion statewide is $33 billion every year. Okay. So roughly speaking, $33 billion a year in school property taxes are paid, $66 billion per budget cycle. We have a $20 billion surplus going into 2025. If we take that surplus, if we take all the spending increases that have gone on, so we just kind of overviewed that for y'all. All the spending increases that have happened, they get to stay in place. Okay? Nobody gets cut a penny, but nobody grows. So nobody gets cut a penny and nobody grows. And if you do have new government projects you want, you just have to cut from a current government project, which I think is pretty reasonable. You got $5 billion you want to spend, just go find another place in the budget to cut, and you have that $5 billion. You take all of the extra money we collected this year that we didn't think we were going to get, $20 billion, and you write it to public schools, okay? You give that money to the public school system, but you do it by also saying you're not going to collect this through local property taxes. What you would do in just this legislative session is cut your school property taxes by a third, okay? The math's pretty simple. It's a third that would get cut in that situation. So that's why we have a Texas budget and these property taxes, and this is where they come together. Because when it comes to your school property taxes, it is as easy as taking that money and moving it in. I can explain the whole way a homestead exemption kind of plays into this at one point, but we're not going to go down that path today. So that's how these two things then play together. If your school property tax portion was eliminated, then you really do that's going to take at least that sixth highest in the nation. We're going to go down. I mean, we're not going to be Tennessee, but we're going to be closer. So Mr. McVeigh, my question for you is, what are y'all doing right now to advocate for real property tax relief to Texans going into 2025?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. And what it comes down to is government spending, as Vance has said. The more the state spends on whatever the projects are, the less revenue that they have available for property tax relief. And so I think opening that discussion up at both the state and local level, at the grassroots level, and in Austin is key, because you hear oftentimes that, we've got to fund this project, we've got to fund that project, and then there's confusion over, well, if we spend the surplus, then we don't have it next time. All of these, educating everybody involved on these issues is key, so that they can start to recognize, hey, actually, there is this pathway to eliminating school M&O property taxes relatively quickly without imposing any new taxes, without raising the sales tax. You're taking the existing system that's in place, and as our economy grows, when the state receives this over-collected taxpayer money, that's all surplus is. They overtax the people, returning that to them in the form of property tax relief focused on the school portion. As you said, that's the largest portion. That's the pathway to get there. And you can cut your property tax bill down by at least a third for Texans across the state, not just homeowners, but small business owners, farmers, ranchers, renters as well. And so really opening up that discussion and talking to folks about that pathway so that it's not just this taboo issue where it's, property taxes are $82 billion every single year. Well, where are we going to find that money? I'm just going to bury my head in the sand and ignore the issue, and we're going to go focus on these other things. Reminding folks that it's the people's money first, and it should be returned to them so that families can thrive.
Vance, my question to you is this. And I've heard you say this several different ways, but let's just say you only did 90% of surplus money. So you said, hey, if a little extra money shows up, even though government grew and the budget's pretty big, you can still take 10 cents out of every dollar of extra over collected taxpayer money and spend it on more government. But nine out of $10 or 90 cents out of every dollar is going to go to property tax relief. If state lawmakers were disciplined and continued to do that, how long does it take to take your school property taxes and just eliminate it entirely?
Within a decade. I mean, and that's looking at historical averages for growth in revenue, and limiting spending to population plus inflation for general revenue, and then using that delta, being the surplus, to buy down the school M&O property tax using the 90%. I actually did it using the 90%, the 90 cents out of every dollar, and bought it down each period, even assuming that property taxes were increasing by about 3.5%. So I just used the historical average there and kind of the maximum, and said, even if it was growing a little bit, which I'd rather it not, we should freeze those property taxes. But if voters wanted to approve them to go up, okay. But even if you had all of those assumptions into place, which I've done in my model, which I love doing some models every once in a while with, having the numbers and seeing what the results will be and everything else, you still would eliminate them within a decade. So that means if we had a frozen Texas budget, not population inflation, but a frozen Texas budget, we could do it in about 7 to 8 years. That's how much savings that you get. If you freeze property taxes, we could also do it within about 8 years as well. So I think if you put all this together, freezing property taxes, having the no new revenue rate for everything else except for school districts, right? And freeze the budget, the Texas budget, we could do this within about 8 years, if not a decade, given some of those other criteria. So it's definitely doable, but the key part is spending restraint at the state and the local levels, and then we can get this done quickly.
Yeah, we have a lot of government in Texas and at a local level, state. So I think it's worth recognizing that what you just laid out, what Andrew's talked about, I know what TFR has encouraged people through the legislative process to do, is just say, we're not telling you to cut any government that currently exists. We're just saying for an 8 to 10 year period, discipline yourself to decide we're not going to increase our lifestyle. This would basically be like a family saying, hey guys, for the next 10 years, how we've lived, we're living. We're not living more luxuriously for the next 10 years. And during that time, we're going to set aside this money and pay off our mortgage, or we're going to set aside this money and get out of debt, or we're going to set aside this money and pay off our cars and save for, I don't know, your kids' weddings or whatever it is. So I used to say kids' college, but I don't want to pay them to go get indoctrinated into Marxist ideology. And so my overarching point is that's basically the discussion we're trying to have at a state level. Hey, the current level at which you're living, that's fine. Just decide you're not going to increase that, and you can really start to give your citizens a pathway to real property tax relief that makes property ownership, possible again. Now, Andrew, I want to close with giving you some credit. A lot of Texans will hear this conversation and go, got it. I'm probably not going to be able to take all this information and apply it every day and know exactly when to look at the legislative budget board, or who on appropriations needs to be held accountable, or what pressure should we give, or what amendments are we pushing for the budget. So I want them to know, how do they engage with Texans for Fiscal Responsibility? And what is it that y'all are doing to help empower taxpayers to be engaged in the process?
Yeah, so we publish, all the research that Vance does, all of this information. It's all on our website, texastaxpayers.com. Of course, we're also on all the major social media platforms as well. They can engage with us there. They can engage with us on our website. They can sign up for our email list. And we're again, our whole mission is to empower taxpayers, right? It's to empower taxpayers and their families so that they can go and advocate for these reforms. It's not just me. It's not just Vance. It's not just you. It's the taxpayers across the state using the Fiscal Responsibility Index, using the research we put on our website to go and engage with their local elected officials, their state representatives and their senators, and say, hey, we are facing an affordability crisis. I cannot afford these massive property tax increases. Here's a pathway to actually help us get out of this sticky situation, right? In a way that's not going to necessarily be painful for anybody. As you said, Luke, if we just freeze the state budget where it's at, we have a pathway to achieving this. And so, again, texastaxpayers.com is where folks across the state can learn more about us, can engage with us, can get on our email list. We'll be sending out more information as we get closer to the legislative session. Of course, during session, we'll be sending out vote notices on those pro or anti-taxpayer bills that are coming up for a vote so that they can contact their legislator and let them know their thoughts. And again, I encourage taxpayers to get involved. And remember too, focusing at the federal level, that's all well and good. Make sure you get out and vote, but taxpayers can have the greatest impact at the state and local level. That's where they can have the greatest impact, and that's the level of government that is that's the level of government that is most directly affecting them. And so, get engaged at your local level. Get engaged with the state legislature. That's where you can have the greatest impact as an individual. And I encourage folks to join us in our mission.
Vance, I know you've been, beating the drum on property taxes and budgets and spending for quite some time. But as you have spent time just with a lot of incoming members who are concerned about this fiscal situation and stuff like that, kind of give Texans insight into where you see things going into 2025. What are the things they should be looking at or following most closely that's going to directly affect how much relief they actually feel and how much state government grows?
Yeah, so it's a big session that's coming up. This past session, we had a $32.7 billion surplus. And now we're looking at another $20 billion surplus going into next session. So already on the table, there's plenty of money, as you said earlier, Luke, that we could cut the school property tax by a third. It'd be massive. It'd be huge for the state of Texas, and more importantly, it'd be huge for Texas families across this great state and allow us to have more opportunities to flourish. But in addition to that, there's going to be a lot of demands. You're going to hear this from a lot of folks, a lot of rent seekers, interest groups that are going to come out there. And I think the key part of this, and this is what's so important about what Texas Fiscal Responsibility is doing, is say, what about the taxpayer? Yes, you have these other things that people want to talk about and expanding programs and doing this, that, and another, but always think about the taxpayer. The ultimate burden of government is not how much revenue it has or anything else like that. It's the amount it spends. Spending is the ultimate burden of government. And so if we don't focus on that part of it, everything else will lead to worse outcomes for the state and our competitiveness with other states. Because remember, we're the 8th largest country in the world. What happens in Texas influences not only the rest of our state, of course, but what happens across the globe. And we need to be the place with the beacon, the shining city on the hill that allows for more economic growth and prosperity. Because if we don't, California's not going to do it. And in New York and Illinois, these other large states, Florida's doing a pretty good job. But I think Texas, it has to be the place where it happens. We're the largest red state. We're the second largest in population compared to California. We've got to get it done by spending less at the state and local levels. Remember, we got to keep making sure that they're keeping it down as well. And if we can do those things, given what all is going to happen next session, you've really got a big opportunity to make a huge dent in property taxes next session.
Thank you, Dr. Ginn. Thank you, Andrew, for joining me today.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you, Luke.
Do you want to get your news from people who share your values? Texas Scorecard, real news for real Texans.